Stumacher has been dead for 30 years, and in Scream 7 he calls Sidney Prescott on the phone. His face, his voice, his specific laugh, aged, given a life he never lived, built from data and code and collective memory. Most people watched that scene and thought, clever twist. What they actually watched was necromancy, the oldest forbidden practice in human history, reconstructed in a Hollywood studio using artificial intelligence and presented as a horror movie plot device. And here is what makes it genuinely terrifying. The occult practitioners who developed necromancy thousands of years ago understood something that our laws, our ethics, and our technology industry have not yet caught up to. The dead do not stay dead. And now we have given them better tools to come back. Welcome to occult cinema, where the screen is the sigil. The deepfakes. Let's establish exactly what happens in this film, because the details matter. Marco Davis is a former Google AI specialist. He left one of the most powerful technology companies in the world and became a supervisor at a psychiatric hospital. He brought his skills with him, and he used them to build something that should not exist. He reconstructed the dead, not one dead person. 4. Stumacher, Roman Bridger, Mrs. Loomis, Dewey Riley, each one a specific chapter in Sidney Prescott's traumatic history. Each one a wound that never fully closed. Each one given back their face, their voice, their specific presence, and then weaponized. The Stu deepfake is the opening move. He calls Tatum, Sidney's teenage daughter, on the phone. His face appears on screen, aged 30 years, given wrinkles and gray hair and the specific physical weight of a man who lived a long life. A life he never actually lived. The deepfake doesn't just resurrect Stu, it invents a version of him that never existed. It gives him decades of fictional experience and presents them as real. Roman Bridger, the forgotten killer, the half-brother, the wound Sidney never fully processed because the film that contained him was the one the franchise tried hardest to forget. Mrs. Loomis, the mother, the original grief, the woman whose son started everything and whose own rage extended it. And then Dewey. Dewey is the cruelest one, because Dewey was loved, not feared, not hated, loved, by Sidney, by Gail, by the audience. His death in Scream 5 was genuinely devastating, one of the few moments in this franchise that landed as real loss rather than horror movie spectacle. Using Dewey's face and voice as a weapon is not just a plot device, it is a precise psychological operation. It targets the specific grief that has no anger attached to it, the grief that is pure, the grief that has no defense. This is the necromancer's art. You do not attack the living with the dead they feared. You attack them with the dead they loved. Because love leaves you open. Love has no armor. 4 dead people, 4 open wounds, 4 weapons assembled from data and code and the collective memory of everyone who ever watched these people die. This is not a clever plot twist. This is a ritual. What necromancy actually is. The word necromancy comes from the Greek. Nekros, meaning the dead, and manteia, meaning divination. Communication with the dead for the purpose of gaining knowledge or power. But the Hollywood version of necromancy, the robed figure in a graveyard raising a shambling corpse, misses the entire point. The corpse is never the target. The corpse is the instrument. The target is always the living. Necromancy, in its genuine historical practice, operates on one central principle. The dead retain a connection to the living through the bonds that existed between them. Love, guilt, unfinished business, grief. These bonds do not dissolve at death. They persist. And a skilled practitioner can reach through those bonds, using the dead as a conduit, and affect the living on the other side. This is why every necromantic tradition across every culture emphasizes the emotional relationship between the summoner and the summoned. You do not call up a stranger. You call up someone whose connection to the living target is still active, still charged, still capable of producing a response. The dead are not the weapon. The relationship is the weapon. Marco and Jessica understand this perfectly. They did not choose 4 random dead people. They chose people they knew would trigger Sidney. The specific people whose loss shaped her, whose absence she carries, whose voices she would recognize in the dark at 3 a.m. from a dead sleep. They built weapons out of grief, and they aimed them with surgical precision. The ancient traditions. Here is the thing about necromancy that the modern world has forgotten. Every culture that has ever existed developed rules around it, not because it was superstition, because it worked. You do not build elaborate legal and ritual systems around something that does nothing. The rules exist because the practice produces results, and the results are dangerous. The Greeks called the dead shades, idola, hollow copies of the living. the shape and voice and manner of a person without the substance, without the will, without the soul that animated the original. The shade of Achilles in the Odyssey tells Odysseus that he would rather be the lowest living slave than the king of all the dead, because the shade is not the person, it is the echo, the residue, the data without the consciousness. The deepfake is the shade, exactly, precisely, the shape and voice and manner of Stumacher, without Stumacher, the echo of a person constructed from the residue of their recorded existence. Let's look at some examples from history. The Witch of Endor from the first book of Samuel. Saul, the king of Israel, desperate, his army about to be destroyed, goes to a necromancer and demands she raise the prophet Samuel from the dead. She does. Samuel appears, and he is furious. Not because the summoning was impossible, but because it worked. Because the dead do not wish to be disturbed. And what Samuel tells Saul destroys him. Not with a curse, but with the truth. The truth Saul already knew and could not face. The necromancer didn't give Saul power. She gave him the thing he was least equipped to survive. Clarity. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is not a book about death. It is a technology manual, a set of precise instructions for navigating the boundary between the living and the dead, for communicating across it, for ensuring that the dead could be reached and that what came back was what you intended to reach. The Egyptians understood that the boundary was permeable, and that permeability required management. Baron Samedi, the voodoo Loa of the dead, the guardian of the crossroads between life and death. He does not prevent communication with the dead. He governs it, he sets the terms, he decides what crosses and what doesn't. In voodoo tradition, the dead are not gone. They are present, accessible, potentially dangerous, and the tradition built an entire cosmology around managing that access responsibly. Every tradition, every culture, every system of knowledge that took consciousness seriously built rules around this, because they all arrived at the same conclusion independently. The boundary between the living and the dead is real, it is permeable, and crossing it without understanding what you are doing will destroy you. Marco Davis had no Baron Samedi. He had no rules. He had a server farm and a dataset and a motive, and he crossed the boundary anyway. The deepfake as an occult object. Now we need to talk about what the deepfake actually is as an object, because when you look at it through the lens of occult tradition, it maps onto existing categories with a precision that should make you uncomfortable. The golem. In Jewish mystical tradition, the golem is a constructed being, built from clay, animated by sacred inscription. The most famous version is the Golem of Prague, built by Rabbi Loew in the 16th century to protect the Jewish community from persecution. The golem was not alive, it was animated. It moved and acted and followed instructions. But it had no soul, no inner life, no will of its own. It was a constructed instrument given the appearance of life through the power of sacred language. The deepfake is a golem made of light and code. It is constructed, assembled from data, from footage, from recordings. It is animated by algorithms, by machine learning, by the sacred inscription of ones and zeros. It moves and speaks and follows the instructions of its creator. But it has no soul, no inner life, no will. It is the appearance of a person without the person. The tulpa. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, a tulpa is a thought form, a being created through concentrated mental energy and intention. Given enough focus, enough collective belief, enough sustained attention, a tulpa can develop a kind of autonomous existence. It can act independently of its creator. It can become something its creator did not intend. A deepfake trained on millions of hours of footage, on every interview, every performance, every recorded moment of a person's public existence, is a tulpa built from collective memory. The more footage it consumes, the more autonomous it becomes. The more it begins to generate responses that its creators did not specifically program. The more it begins to feel to the people who interact with it, like the real thing. And the voice. In occult tradition, the voice is the seat of power. The vibration of the spoken word carries intention into the physical world. This is the basis of every incantation, every prayer, every ritual invocation, across every tradition. The voice is not just communication, it is creation. In the beginning was the word. To replicate the voice of the dead is the most dangerous form of necromancy, because the voice carries the emotional signature of the person, the specific frequency of their presence. When you hear the voice of someone you loved who is dead, your body responds before your mind can intervene. The grief activates, the bond activates, the wound opens. Marco knew this. He didn't just build faces, he built voices. Because the face can be doubted. The voice goes straight to the nervous system. The killers as necromancers. Marco Davis and Jessica Bowden are not just killers. They are a complete magical partnership. Every necromantic operation in the historical record requires two things. The technician, the one who knows the mechanics, who understands the ritual structure, who can build and operate the instrument of summoning. And the true believer, the one whose emotional investment powers the operation, whose obsession provides the fuel, whose wound gives the working its direction and its force. Marco is the technician, former Google AI specialist. He understands the mechanics of digital resurrection at the deepest level. He knows how to build the golem, how to train the tulpa, how to reconstruct the voice with enough fidelity to bypass the rational mind and go straight to the grief. He is the modern sorcerer, the man who crossed from the technology industry into the psychiatric hospital, from the world of the living into the world of those kept between worlds, and brought his tools with him. The psychiatric hospital is not an accident as a setting. In every tradition that takes the boundary between life and death seriously, the people who live closest to that boundary are the ones who can most easily cross it. The dying, the mad, the ones whose grip on consensus reality has loosened enough that other realities become accessible. Marco chose to work there. He surrounded himself with people living at the edge of the world, and he used that proximity. Jessica is the true believer, and her belief is the most contemporary form of magical thinking that exists. Parasocial obsession. She read Sydney's book, Out of Darkness. She treated it as a grimoire, a personal instruction manual for transformation. She used it to justify killing her abusive husband. And when Sydney did not appear in New York during the events of Scream 6, when the real person failed to live up to the mythological figure Jessica had constructed, she did not update her belief. She redirected her rage. This is exactly what happens when a magical working goes wrong, when the practitioner's investment in the outcome exceeds their connection to reality. Jessica didn't want to kill Sydney. She wanted to complete the ritual. She wanted to force Tatum through the same initiatory ordeal that Sydney survived, to create a new final girl, a Sydney 2.0, by destroying the original in front of her daughter. She wanted to use the dead to manufacture a new myth. That is not a murder plot. That is a magical operation. The philosophical layer, grief as vulnerability. What does it mean to see the face of someone you loved who is dead? Not a photograph, not a memory, a moving, speaking, responding presence, the specific way they tilted their head, the exact cadence of their laugh, the pause before they said your name. Your mind knows it is not real. Your nervous system does not care. This is the uncanny valley weaponized. The uncanny valley is the psychological phenomenon where something that is almost but not quite human produces a response of deep unease. The deep fake sits right at the edge of that valley, close enough to the real thing to activate the emotional response, different enough to produce a creeping wrongness that the conscious mind cannot immediately name. In 2021, a documentary about Anthony Bourdain was released. The filmmakers used AI to reconstruct his voice from his own writing, emails, notes, and passages he had never spoken aloud, and they used it to narrate sections of the film. When his daughter heard it, she said it made her deeply uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, because it was right enough, because it activated the grief response and then delivered something her father never actually said. Her memory of his voice and the AI reconstruction became entangled. The boundary between what he actually said and what the algorithm generated blurred. This is false memory production through technological necromancy, and it is happening right now without regulation, without consent, without any framework for understanding what it does to the people it targets. The consent of the dead. This is the question that every occult tradition answered, and that our legal system has almost entirely failed to address. Can the dead consent to being resurrected? Do they retain rights over their own voice, their own face, their own likeness? The law says almost nothing. The occult traditions say everything. Every system of necromantic practice built elaborate rules around consent, around what the dead could be asked, what they could be compelled to do, what protections existed for both the summoner and the summoned. We dismantled all of those rules when we decided this was technology instead of magic, and we are only beginning to understand what we lost. The meta layer. Here's where Scream 7 becomes genuinely extraordinary. The film did to its audience exactly what the killers did to Sydney. Jessica's breakdown, her rage at Sydney for not appearing in New York, her sense of betrayal that the real person failed to match the mythological figure, is a direct in-universe mirror of the real audience reaction to Neve Campbell's absence from Scream 6. Campbell left the franchise over a salary dispute. Fans were furious. The film felt wrong without her. The final girl was gone, and what remained felt like a deepfake of the franchise itself. Kevin Williamson, the man who created Scream, who wrote the original screenplay, who built the entire mythology, was summoned back to fix it. Think about what that is. The original creator called back from outside the franchise to resurrect its soul. That is a necromantic act. Williamson is the necromancer of the Scream universe. He reached back into the original and pulled something forward that the sequels had lost. And Neve Campbell's return is the film's central argument, the real thing versus the constructed copy. Sidney alive, present, physical, irreplaceable, is more powerful than any deepfake of any dead person. Because the deepfake can replicate the appearance, it cannot replicate the presence, the soul, the specific irreducible reality of a living person who has been through the fire and survived. The film is arguing for authenticity in an age of copies. It is saying, the original matters, the real thing matters, and no amount of technological resurrection can replace what is genuinely, irreversibly alive. The Scream franchise is a cult text. Scream has always been an occult text. We just never called it that. The Ghostface mask is one of the most recognizable images in modern horror. But look at it through the lens of occult tradition. The mask in shamanic and ceremonial practice is not a disguise. It is a transformation. When the shaman puts on the mask of the spirit, they do not pretend to be the spirit. They become a vessel for it. The mask erases the individual identity and opens a channel for something else to move through. Ghostface works exactly this way. It is not a costume. It is a role. Anyone can put it on. Anyone can become Ghostface. The mask is the tulpa, the thought form that exists independently of any individual wearer. Billy Loomis wore it, Stu Macher wore it, a dozen killers across 7 films wore it, the wearers die, the mask remains, and the entity persists. The phone call is a ritual invocation. Every Ghostface attack begins the same way. The call, the voice, the specific questions. This is not a practical communication. It is a summoning. The killer is not gathering information. The killer is opening the ritual space, establishing the terms, announcing the beginning of the working, and the rules. Scream has always been about the rules. What you can and cannot do in a horror movie, who survives and who doesn't. The rules are occult law, the specific conditions that govern the operation of life and death within the ritual space of the film. Randy knew the rules. Mindy knows the rules. The rules are the grimoire. The real-world necromancy. Everything we have discussed so far is in a film. Now we need to talk about what is happening outside the cinema. In 1992, Tupac Shakur was murdered. In 2012, 16 years after his death, a hologram of him performed at Coachella. The audience lost their minds. They screamed. They reached toward the stage. They responded to the constructed image of a dead man with the full emotional force of encountering the living person. The grief activated, the bond activated, the wound opened. That was 2012. The technology was primitive by current standards. James Dean was cast in a film in 2019, 80 years after his death. His estate licensed his likeness. He did not consent. He could not consent. He was dead, but his face and his voice and his specific physical presence were reconstructed and put to work in a production he never agreed to participate in. The grief industry is already selling AI resurrection to bereaved families. Companies exist right now that will take the voicemails, the home videos, the text messages of your dead loved one, and build you an interactive AI that responds as they would have responded, that answers questions in their voice, that says things they never said in the cadence they would have used to say them. And there are almost no laws governing any of this. The occult practitioners of history understood something that our legal system has not yet grasped. The dead have a relationship with the living that does not end at death. That relationship can be exploited, it can be weaponized, it can be used to manipulate, to control, to destroy, and without rules, without the equivalent of Baron Samedi standing at the crossroads deciding what crosses and what doesn't, the boundary becomes a free-for-all. Marco Davis had no rules. The technology industry has no rules, and the results in both cases are the same. The dead are being raised, not in graveyards, in server farms, not with ritual and intention and the accumulated wisdom of traditions that understood the danger. With processing power and datasets and the complete absence of any framework for what this does to the living people it targets. We are all targets now. Here is the question the film does not ask, but should. What happens when someone uses this technology on you? Not on Sidney Prescott, not on a fictional final girl with 30 years of survival experience and the accumulated wisdom of 7 ordeals. On you. On the specific grief you carry. On the specific dead person whose voice you would recognize in the dark at 3 a.m. from a dead sleep. Your dead parent. Your dead child. Your dead partner, reconstructed from the data they left behind. From the voicemails you kept. From the videos on your phone. from the recordings they never knew were being preserved, given back to you as a weapon aimed at the most undefended part of you. This is not a hypothetical. The technology exists, the data exists, the motive, financial, political, personal, exists. The only thing that does not exist is the protection. The occult practitioners of history were not superstitious primitives. They were people who had encountered something real and built systems to manage it responsibly. The rules around necromancy were not arbitrary. They were the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who learned the hard way what happens when the boundary between the living and the dead is crossed without care. We threw those rules away when we decided this was technology instead of magic. We told ourselves that because the mechanism was digital rather than ritual, because the instrument was a server farm rather than a summoning circle, the old wisdom did not apply. It applies: the dead do not stay dead. They never did. Every tradition that ever took consciousness seriously knew this. The question was never whether the dead could be given a voice. The question was always, who controls that voice? Who decides what the dead say to the living? Who stands at the crossroads and governs what crosses? Right now the answer is, whoever has the data and the processing power and the motive. Scream 7 put this on screen and called it a horror movie. It is a horror movie, but it is also a warning. Dressed in a ghost face mask, calling you on the phone, in a voice you recognize. And the question it is really asking, the question underneath all the blood and the meta-commentary and the franchise callbacks, is the oldest question necromancy ever asked. When the dead speak, are you strong enough not to answer? The screen was the sigil. The sigil worked, and the dead are already calling.